Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to this breakout session, Cultivating Collaboration, Protecting Crop Biodiversity for a Resilient Future, presented by UK Science and Innovation Network and the Crop Trust. My name is Kyle Dolan. I'm the US lead for food and agriculture within the UK Science and Innovation Network based in the United States. We are UK government's overseas diplomatic corps for science and technology affairs, facilitating connections that enhance the power of the UK's international research and innovation partnerships in order to improve people's lives and meet today's biggest global challenges. Few such challenges compare in scale and complexity to that of meeting the world's need for food. As you've already heard from some of our speakers today, it touches on so many other issues, in particular when considered alongside the steady loss of the world's biodiversity. The degradation of nature, together with the ongoing climate change emergency, represent what UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy has called the central geopolitical challenge of our age. Against this triple threat of climate change, biodiversity loss, and food insecurity, the long-term preservation of crop biodiversity stands as a bulwark, a global public good that holds the key to future climate resilience in food systems. That is why, last year, the UK committed £5 million to support the invaluable work of the Crop Trust in protecting the priceless diversity of the world's food crops, efforts which you'll hear more about shortly and throughout this week as we celebrate our laureates, Jeff Houghton, who we're very, very pleased to have with us today, and Dr. Carrie Fowler from the US. And that is why we are here today to be co-hosting this session with Crop Trust. Before we open the program, a few words of thanks. Thank you to the World Food Prize Foundation for the chance to present this session. Thank you to our collaborators at Crop Trust to produce the session, particularly Jaspreet Stam, Alicia Stavin, and Cody Gildart. Thank you again to Jeff Houghton, our laureate and keynote speaker, for being with us today. It is an honor to have you join us. And thank you to our distinguished panelists who will join us to share their insights later. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Sharada Krishnan, Director of Programs at Crop Trust, to facilitate today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle, and good morning, everyone. It is such a pleasure to have all of you here today. And I think this overall theme about climate change and the challenges that we are facing globally for food and nutrition security is something that you're going to be hearing all throughout this conference. So, I think, we are now facing multifaceted challenges in the world right now. And so for our food challenges, conserving and using crop diversity is one of the key to overcoming these challenges. So for this to happen, we need multi-stakeholder collaboration. So today's session is all about collaborations, and it will highlight how different actors are forging partnerships to tackle these challenges. And we have an eminent scientist today who will kick off with a keynote, and then we will have a panel discussion, and then we will have a few minutes for Q&A from the audience. So with that, I am going to introduce our keynote speaker today, who is Dr. Jeff Houghton, and who is our one of the 2024 World Food Prize laureates. And Jeff is, we are also fortunate to have Jeff on our executive board, and also he was a founding founder of the Global Crop Diversity Trust. So Jeff is an agricultural scientist and manager with expertise in agrobiodiversity, genetic resources, plant breeding, and research management. He has headed 2 CGIAR centers, which is the Biodiversity International, which was at that time called IPGRI, which is the International Plant Genetic Resources Institute in Rome, from 1991 to 2003, and the Centro Internacional de Agricultura Tropical, which is CIAT, in Colombia from 2008 to 2009. Sorry, my Spanish is not so good. While at IPGRI, he led the creation of the Global Crop Diversity Trust and was its first chief executive officer from 2003 to 2005. He also served as Director of Agriculture, Food and Nutrition Sciences Division of the International Development Research Center, IDRC, in Canada, and was Deputy Director General of the International Center for Agricultural Research in Dry Areas, which is ICARDA in Syria. So anyway, in 2024, so he is on many different boards, and he was awarded the Frank Meyer Medal for Plant Genetic Resources by the Crop Science Society of America. And then in 2017, he was awarded an OBE by the UK's Queen Elizabeth II for services for global agrobiodiversity conservation, sustainable livelihood enhancement, and sustainable food programs. So with that, I invite Dr. Jeff Houghton to give his keynote presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks for that introduction, which I think was a little overblown. The topic today is obviously an extremely important one. And everyone always talks about collaboration, partnerships, and how critical they are. And I would pose that for the whole area of genetic diversity, that this is particularly true, and perhaps for two main reasons. One is just because of the level of interdependence we have around the world among all countries for genetic resources, for crop diversity. It's been estimated that approximately 70% of the crops grown in on average, in any country, originated outside that country. Likewise, approximately 70% of the food eaten on average in every country originated elsewhere. So there's a huge level of interdependence in terms of agriculture and nutrition for the crops, and therefore for the genetic diversity of those crops that's needed to improve them. Secondly, I would say if you look at genetic diversity, it's such a huge topic because we're not only talking here about conserving genetic resources, but we're also talking about their use. Unless they're used, there's no point in conserving them. And I think in the past, as one of the things I would level against the conservation community is it's tended to be rather inward-looking. It's seen conservation as, in some ways, as an end in itself. That is likely to be the death of support for genetic resource conservation. Material has to be used. And its potential to be used is enormous. And I think within the genetic resource community over the last few years, this link between the conservation and the use has been growing ever stronger. And today we're seeing that really it's just two sides of the same coin. Conserving without use, without contributing to plant breeding, whatever, it's no point in conserving. But equally, you're hampering the use and development of varieties and so on unless you've got the raw material, the genetic diversity you need to underpin the breeding. But because you've got these two sides of the coin, it also means that you've got a huge range of different institutions around the world involved in some way in genetic resources. On the conservation side, you've got everything from the sort of local community gene banks through to the sort of public universities, to international gene banks, national programs, and increasingly coming into the picture botanical gardens. And why is that? Because increasingly as plant breeders are looking towards crop wild relatives as a source of genes, as a source of traits in their breeding work. And a lot of those crop wild relatives are plants that are conserved by botanical gardens. And several botanical gardens around the world now are beginning to look at how they can support the agricultural world. So partnerships are essential. So not only among that group of conserving institutions, but particularly also with institutions that use the material, with seed companies, with plant breeding companies, whether that's local, national, or international. And those partnerships are absolutely essential. The Crop Trust has, among its objectives, I think its second objective reads, to promote an efficient, goal-oriented, economically efficient, and sustainable global system of ex situ conservation. It sees this really as a global system. Must be goal-oriented, must be efficient, must be economically efficient. This is wording also taken from the Global Plan of Action, sponsored under FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, that uses the same language in its plan of action for genetic diversity. So what's needed in order to get these institutions, diverse institutions, both north and south, to work together? First of all, I think it's a common vision. And I think that is evolving, that is developing, but I think that if people are going to work together, there needs to be an element in which they're all pointed in the same direction, all have, if not identical, then at least similar objectives. And in order to participate in any such collaboration partnerships, of course, it has to be according to the needs of the individual institutions concerned, each using its own comparative advantage. So if you're looking at, for example, local community gene banks, what's their advantage? Their knowledge of the local community, their knowledge of the local crops, their ability to communicate with farmers in their own language, and so on. But they don't necessarily have a comparative advantage in conserving in long term or in large amounts. But a link with the National Gene Bank may well take care of that. But that requires trust, that requires some sort of formal communication and agreements. Likewise, between the national programs and the international gene banks. Again, I think if you look, national programs serving national interests, international gene banks probably better positioned to do international distribution of seeds, for example. CGIAR distributes approximately 100,000 samples every year to partner institutions, north, south, public, private, other gene banks and breeders. So in order to do this, and we'll hear now from some experts on ideas on how that system, that partnerships, that network can be strengthened. But it seems to me that in addition to a common vision, it needs to have very good information systems. People need to know what's going on. They need to be able to share ideas. They also need to be able to share materials. And I think there's policy elements here where even now there are still considerable barriers in many cases to free exchange of material among those that would wish to access it and use it, and those that have it to provide. There are opportunities for sharing facilities, whether they're conservation facilities, facilities for regenerating materials, perhaps sharing regeneration responsibilities to minimize genetic drift by regenerating in as close as possible to original environments. Research collaboration, there's still a lot of research needed, especially in the non-food crops. Cryopreservation, I think, and I think there's another session later on today that will be looking a bit at this, is collaboration in conserving clonally propagated crops through cryopreservation. Again, coming back to the critical link between conservation and use. For many developing countries, conservation is not really a priority because they lack the ability to use the materials. And it's often said that, well, access to materials is the benefit itself. Well, if you can't use it, there's no benefit in having access to materials internationally. So I think a huge effort needs to go into working with developing countries, the global south, institutions to build the plant breeding institutions and those institutions that will use the material and turn what is a conserved treasure house of diversity into something that can make a truly impact at the farm level. And to do that, of course, needs resources. And that's perhaps again where the crop trust comes in. We're talking, and we heard huge figures this morning of amounts of money being spent on we heard mention of trillions and certainly hundreds of billions of dollars. The crop trust currently estimates that if it had an endowment of $850 million, that would be sufficient to the offtake for that would essentially be sufficient to guarantee the conservation of all of the key major crop collections around the world. 850 million. So in today's world, this is a drop in the ocean. But without these resources, I think these partnerships we're talking about that are absolutely so vital will not be successful. So with that, I'll leave you on that note. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks. I think the key highlight was conservation, the need to build a global system for conservation of XC2 genetic resources, and also linking conservation with use. So with that, the use part, I think we have three stellar panelists that we are going to tap into how we can build collaboration and what are the different needs of those different groups that stakeholders that they represent. So I will probably go ahead and take a seat there, and then I will invite you, and you can come over there. Let me. Okay. I'm going to start with Dr. Nitya Rao. Go ahead and come on, Nitya. And Nitya is a professor of gender and development at the University of East Anglia, United Kingdom, and director of the Norwich Institute of Sustainable Development. She has worked as a researcher and advocate in the field of women's rights, gendered well-being, and justice, with a focus on food, nutrition, health, and livelihood security. She has published extensively on the gendered changes in agrarian relations, migration and livelihoods, especially in context of climate variability and economic precarity. She has consistently engaged with policy and practice at both the global and local levels. Apart from supporting networks of women farmers in India, she served on the Global Advisory Committee of the United Nations Girls Education Initiative for over a decade, and on the steering group of the high-level panel of experts to the Committee on World Food Security for 2 terms. She's currently Commissioner Eat Lancet 2.0 on healthy and sustainable diets, member of the Scientific Advisory Committee of United Nations Food Systems Coordination Hub, member of the UKRI International Strategic Advisory Group, and member of the UK CGIAR's Science Advisory Committee and external advisor, and also People-Centered Food Systems Project at Columbia University. Welcome, Nitya, to this panel.
Thank you so much.
And next, we are honored to have Mr. Paul Schickler, who was president of DuPont Pioneer, now Corteva AgriScience, the advanced seed genetics business of DuPont from 2007 to 2017. In his role, he continued to expand Pioneer's global business by advancing innovation that improves local productivity and profitability of farmers throughout the world. Mr. Schickler joined Pioneer in 1974 and served in a variety of finance, commercial, and administrative leadership roles, including Vice President of International Operations from 1999 to 2007. Mr. Schickler is a graduate of Drake University, where he received Bachelor of Science and Masters of Arts degrees in Business Administration. He has served on the board of directors of the Cultivation Corridor, the Greater Des Moines Partnership, the Iowa Business Council, and Grandview University. He also served on the Iowa Partnership for Economic Progress Committee. He currently serves on the board of directors of Drake University, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and the World Food Prize Foundation. He's a strong contributor to the community, as he has been the chair of the 2018 United Way of Central Iowa campaign and provides ongoing support for the World Food Prize Global Youth Institute. His company, 3Ag LLC, provides consulting services to ag tech companies in the fields of biologics, analytics, sensing, grain composition modification, and international expansion. Thank you, Paul, for joining us today. And our third panelist today is Dr. Ruth Bastow. Ruth is the Innovation Director of the UK Agri-Tech Centre funded by Innovate UK. The UK ATC helps businesses translate ideas into viable solutions at scale and pace, delivering new products and services to the UK and international markets. The Agri-Tech Center's unique innovation ecosystem nurtures businesses to develop, test, and trial innovative solutions from laboratory to field conditions. Working with innovators, commercial partners, collaborative networks or partnerships to translate ideas into viable products, driving innovation and delivering solutions that will address global challenges. Amongst her previous leadership roles, Ruth was the executive director of the Global Plant Council and was involved in the Diversity Seek initiative. Thanks, Ruth, also for joining us. So I will ask each panelist a question, and they have up to 2 to 3 minutes to answer them. And I will go ahead and start with you, Nithya. So how is crop diversity informing Norwich Institutes of Sustainable Development's research, and what are the latest, most exciting trends?
Yeah, thanks, Sharada, for that question, and it's a real pleasure and honor to be on this panel. So I think 2 points really I wanted to make. Much of our work at NISD with crops, with aquatic food systems, and also some alternate proteins. Some of my own work more recently with justice within food systems, particularly with the Eat Lancet Commission and the recently released Global Hunger Index 2024. They do demonstrate that dietary diversity, dietary awareness is very important for human nutrition, for human health. And for this, of course, crop diversity is very important, very integral part of it. So I think one significant, exciting moment for me and for our work at NISD is to really recognize also the nutritional potential. I mean, this was always known, but the nutritional potential of crops and crop diversity, and going beyond household staples. In my own work, working with gender and working with communities, actually today, if we find globally, most of the farms and most of crop diversity is managed by women farmers. There was a beautiful statue actually at the Hall of Laureates, which I visited, of a woman holding a hoe. So I think this is something which is the reality of today in farming and farms, but is often forgotten. And we don't really consult farmers or women farmers when thinking about breeding priorities or preferences and so on. So one of the exciting projects that currently I'm involved in is part of the UK CJR, working with ICARDA, actually across 3 countries, and the NARS in the National Agricultural Research Systems in Kenya, in Egypt, and in Pakistan, to really look at varieties of wheat which are resistant to new forms of rust, but also to address the problem of iron anemia, especially amongst women in these countries. And I think it's very exciting to try and start from a bottom up in terms of looking at gendered preferences and farmers' preferences in terms of what they value in terms of new seed varieties. The second, I think very quickly, which I want to give you, one of the examples that NISD has been working on is with grass pea, which is, of course, as Jeff just mentioned, one of very drought and flood-tolerant legumes, very high protein levels, but of course it has some health implications for populations which are already malnourished. So we are working with the John Innes Centre in Norwich, actually with the Crop Trust, the James Hutton Institute, and ICARDA, to resequence and phenotype a large panel of grass peas from around the world. And we know that this crop has been cultivated for over 8,000 years over a huge geographic range, from Bangladesh in South Asia to Europe to Portugal, and there is substantial genetic diversity amongst the land races, but none of this has really been accessed so far. So modern tools, of course, are available of genomics, biochemistry, gene editing, and so on, so we can improve. But just I wanted to conclude with the point that Jeff made, that this only matters if these resources end up improving the plants farmers actually grow. Few grass pea varieties have actually been released so far, but on top of that, they've also not been widely adopted. So one of the things that we are trying to do in Ethiopia is to really work with farmers to inform the breeding process, but also to identify what are the blockages or what are the challenges that are preventing adoption. So I think I maybe would stop with these 2 examples, the importance of looking at gender relations and complexities and women farmers' needs, but also how do we understand the challenges that farmers face in accessing nutrition-rich varieties like grass pea.
Yeah. Thanks, Nitya, for highlighting, like, we need to go beyond the staples. There is so much diversity there that we are not tapping into, that we need to go beyond the staples that we are used to. So now I'll go to you, Ruth. So from your experience with UK Agri-Tech Center, what are the latest advances and trends in agri-tech relating to or utilizing crop diversity?
Thank you, and thank you for being invited to speak on the panel today. So I think that as the other industrial sectors are seeing that robotics, AI, automation coming through, and you can see that across agriculture, particularly on crop diversity, thinking on the genotyping end, thinking about new models, new algorithms that can help you actually find new traits. So that's on that end, but at the phenotyping end, really thinking about new sensors and robotics to be able to identify those traits more easily in your breeding populations as you go forwards. So those are one of the big trends there for me in that, and really reducing that parameter space so it's less costly for companies down the line to come and use it. The other thing we're really seeing, although land-based agriculture will be, I guess, the main body of food-based agriculture going forward, we're seeing a lot of these novel production systems. So thinking about maybe the vertical farming sector, where you're thinking about production maybe when you can't due to geography, maybe land use, but also actually you just don't have enough light in the day. So they're thinking about the sort of new crops you may want to breed. Maybe they're there already, you just want them in dwarf or short stature. But also you might want new varieties, thinking about new plant proteins we might want within these varieties, ones that perhaps you never thought about before. They lodged really easily, they didn't have robustness, maybe disease out in the field. But in these controlled environments, you don't have to think about that so much anymore. So a great opportunity for our rich crop diversity in that area too. And then lastly, thinking about crop diversity in ecosystem services, beyond food, beyond yield, what else are you doing with your landscape? So really thinking about the things that you want to do, maybe for carbon capture in the future, thinking about water, air use. These are the things that we think about, and we could use crop diversity in these areas too.
Thank you so much. I think you bring some really good key points about, AI and robotics, as well as different methods of farming, because land use, we have limited in our land. And so we need to think about innovative ways of looking at farming. And we can't forget the other services like ecosystem, like soils and the microbes and pollinators. So all of those are important things to take into consideration. So, and then moving to Paul. Paul, I think you've been with Pioneer DuPont. You've been in the industry most of your career. And so reflecting on your work at DuPont Pioneer and 3Ag, what is the private sector looking to innovate? How are gene banks important in the work of the private sector?
Right. Very good question. And I think, first of all, you can look at the past, and that is, if you look at really the last century, private industry has made tremendous advances in productivity. Here in the United States, I think the number is, in the 1920s, corn yield was about 30 bushels to the acre. Today, it's about 180. So tremendous advancements in productivity, and a lot of that comes from utilizing the diverse nature of the corn hybrids, from not only recent history, but all the way back to the beginning of corn development in the United States. That challenge continues today. We're going to need to continue to improve productivity. But now we're facing additional challenges, and this is where I think the utilization of gene banks or resources like the Crop Trust can be particularly valuable. So we've got climate change clearly facing us. And environmental zones are shifting and changing, whether that's shifting geography or the problems of drought or lack of water or excess water. And those challenges, in addition to continuing to deliver productivity, are going to be important for the future. I'd also add diseases to that. Diseases migrate and shift over time. And again, we can go back and look at varieties or lines from the past to attack some of those problems. And then finally, I would also add nutrition and grain composition. Again, going back and mining some of the resources of the past to get at nutritional needs that we have today, or to modify the grain composition, improving the levels of oil, or the protein in crops can also be a meaningful use of crop genetics from our past. An example, back to private industry, my career at Pioneer. Pioneer has the pedigree lines of all of its genetic resources for the last 100 years and can look back and look at those lines and decide which one of those characteristics or combination of characteristics are needed to deal with environmental zone shifting, diseases that are now a challenge that maybe, 80 years, 100 years ago were also a challenge. And then also to get at the more immediate needs that we face in improving nutrition and improving the grain composition. So bottom line is, I think private industry has made good use to continue to deliver productivity, but now we have meaningful challenges around climate change, disease shifts, and nutrition and grain composition.
Thank you so much. And then I know as we discuss expanding into underutilized crops, I think we would really need the industry also engaged in it because, the staples industry has made advances in leaps and bounds. I think now underutilized crops, they are underutilized because we have not had investment going into them.
Right.
So I think in the future, as we do that, we will need industry to be more engaged. So, okay, going back to you, Nitya, how can, I know we talked about AI and a little bit about robotics, how can intersectional understandings of farmers' needs guide the development of more effective technologies such as AI for improved livelihoods?
Yeah, so thanks for that. I think as Ruth mentioned, I think we have technologies now in general, whether it's precision breeding or use of water very carefully, resistant seeds with resistance to pests and diseases, and so on. So I think this exists. Remote sensing, deep learning, many of these tools. I think the point is that there's nothing automatic about the translation of having these tools and actually meeting the problem of food and nutrition security. Those who have resources, I think, will be the ones to benefit first. And it's going to be a long time for catch-up if we allow sort of, trickle-down kind of approaches. It's going to be a long time for the poor or the resourceless to get access to these technologies. So I think what we do think is very important is that I think it's important to have public investment. I think we've been talking about private sector to build the value chains, but public investment in really understanding the challenges in relation to equity, that who faces what problems, is it men, is it women? We heard about youth, we heard about jobs, about lack of capital and finance this morning. So youth may be very entrepreneurial, but if we don't give them the finance, we are setting them up to fail. I think this is what Adesina said in the morning. So I think understanding that complexity is really important in terms of, and I think that's what I mean by intersectional, that looking really at the difference, not treating all farmers or all communities as a homogeneous group, but looking at who they are, what kind of needs they have, are they small farmers, are they large farmers, and then addressing that problem. So I think that's key. And for this, I think we really need to invest in creating an equitable knowledge system. So we heard a lot about digital technologies in the morning, but we also heard from the ADB that it's not automatic, that everybody doesn't have access to smartphones, for instance. So how do we make this knowledge equally accessible to everybody? So I think addressing that problem of equity to make technology results really effective, I think is important.
Yeah, it's so important to consider the different segments of a society and then tailor the intervention based on the community that we are working with. Okay, Ruth, can you highlight the importance of evidence-based approaches to innovation in advancing success of the agriculture sector and ensuring end-user adoption? So which is also the same because it's not the homogeneous, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the UK Agritech Centre, we're really focused on accelerating that development and deployment of agritech innovation, which means you really need to understand your end user and need to understand what it is they require. We often see these great solutions that come out of the R&D that are looking for a problem, and really what you need to consider about is what your problem is and make sure your R&D is actually focused on that instead. So that means you require an evidence base to prove that. So you need to be able to actually prove what bottleneck, what pain you're identifying for the industry, the sector, or even the end user. And so to do that, there are some basics here. Is it going to displace the product on the market? Are you going to think about where the ROI is? Do you really have a route to market? Last night, Nidhi and I were talking about some of the things that, if you want to produce a new plant protein, do you have the pull through to process that? Do you have someone, and we heard that this morning, have you got the takeoff for this in the country it's being produced? So this evidence base needs to be thought about as well. And then also trying to think about, is your crop going to fit in with current agronomic use? It's no good if you've got a new crop to harvest, if you've got to buy new kit to do it. So there's a lot of evidence there. Apart from the basic evidence, is your trait going to be utilized in the field? Does it have good agronomic practice? All of this. And the other thing is to really think about what evidence you need to get through the regulatory hoops you need to think about for that product too. So there's a lot about regulation often holds things back. So the evidence base you're going to need for that, I think, is really important. And with that in mind, I think we need to think about that as processes, standards, accreditations we need for the future. There, Paul, you're talking about the things we need for climate change, to think about this. Do our breeding pipelines really take that into account? Are we thinking about what we need now for the future, for its nutritional content? Maybe the soil will be depleted, the microbiome would have changed, diseases are shifting. Are we thinking about our pipelines for that for the future? So I think these evidence bases we really need to think about as we're going forward, so we're prepped for what's around the corner.
Thanks, Ruth. I know you made an important point about understanding who the end users are. And so, Paul, a question to you, because in the private industry, the breeders are the end users of crop genetic diversity. So how can we make genetic resources conserved in gene banks more attractive to the private sector?
Well, there's maybe two answers to that question. One is companies will make use, and then I think the other is a little bit more futuristic, and companies can. The examples or the comments under companies will use gene banks, again, as they address climate change, environmental shifts, and diseases, they will. And I can give you a good example that just occurred in the last 20 years here in North America. Pioneer was part of that, and it was, you could certainly see that the climate and the environmental zones of northern United States and western prairies of Canada was shifting. It was becoming warmer further north, and the rains that were needed for crops were a little bit more favorable. And so we at Pioneer looked at those changes that were occurring, and we made meaningful investments in research and in production facilities and in logistics to build out our systems to basically enable the shift from cereal grains in those same geographies to corn and soybeans, more profitability opportunities for farmers. And that the investment was made because we could see the shifts occurring, and as a result, we delivered new varieties and hybrids to those environmental zones that were changing. Now, that was the answer to sort of, the will. Companies will do it when they see the challenge, the problem, or their business shifting. Now I'll focus to the future and what companies can do. And we need to do a better job, all of us, of identifying future needs that are only now emerging. And that is getting to the nutritional side or improving the grain composition so that there's more value in what the farmer produces. And in order to do that, we, all of us, need to do a better job of communicating the opportunities, because businesses will explore opportunities if they see an issue that is emerging, a solution that is practical, farmers needing solution, and then ultimately the value that is created. So the word needs to get out to all aspects or players in the food chain, all the way from farmers and governments and NGOs, all the way through processors, grocery stores, and consumer good marketers, that we can pursue value through improved nutrition and grain composition. If that message is widely spread, then companies will pursue that opportunity and use some of the genetic resources that are available to go after the nutritional and grain composition challenges that we will face now and into the future.
Good. Thank you. I think all three of you, from your different perspectives, I think it all comes back, how the use of these genetic diversity, which is the key to improving either nutrition or adapting to climate change, all the different challenges. And I think there needs to be sector-wide collaboration. So I think we have about 10 minutes left, and I will invite Jeff over to come and have a seat here, and then I can open up for questions from the audience. So if any of you have questions for the audience, I will, yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Nicholas Spence, I'm Chief Health Officer for UK. So this morning, Carrie was talking about opportunity crops. So I just wonder what your thoughts are about, where should we be looking in existing known biodiversity for future crops, and where else should we be looking to find new biodiversity?
Yeah, thank you, Nicola, for that. There are opportunity crops everywhere you look for them, in a way. But one of the issues with them are that why are they not better grown? In most cases, you'll find there is a reason why they are minor crops or underutilized crops, or whatever term you wish to use. And it can be an issue of lack of market. It can be the insufficient yield, unable to get the sort of economic returns necessary. There could be taste problems, cooking problems, and so on. So there's a whole range of different things, that are reasons why. So if you're going to develop these crops, and some of them have got a tremendous potential. I mean, they've got a huge, maybe very valuable nutritionally, or very able to grow in very dry or hot environments. But in order to develop them, it's going to be essential to develop the market and to probably breed them to try and get varieties that will actually meet the needs without having the detrimental side effects. So, yes, the VAX program that Carrie referred to is mainly focused on Africa. And there are hundreds of locally grown, or in some cases gathered foods, which could be potentially important crops in the future. A lot of these would have, let's say, things like drought resistance and so on. But everywhere you look in the Middle East, where I spent a lot of my time, there's a lot of food that's gathered, or minor crops that are currently minor crops, which could have a potential. But in order to fulfill that potential, there's quite a lot of work needed.
Thanks, Jeff. I know. Yeah.
And certainly we need to focus attention on minor crops, or in the words of others, orphan crops. But at the same time, and now I'm coming at it from my business experience and career, we shouldn't ignore the staple crops. Corn, soybeans, wheat, and rice are grown on 800 million hectares around the world. And there's a reason for that, sort of like as Jeff is saying. Number one, there's a market for them. But second, they are also environmentally adapted to those geographies, and also in many cases culturally adapted. Maize in Mexico, rice in India, wheat in Ukraine. There's a lot of culture behind those as well. And so I think there's an opportunity, again, back to my original comment, not ignoring orphan crops or the other crops, but at the same time, there's an opportunity with commodity crops to improve the nutrition, the value, the grain composition, to make them more effective in not only delivering
Thanks,
calories, but filling the nutrition gap as well.
And I know both of you wanted to. Okay, go ahead. Nithya also
So just very
respond.
quickly, I think this is also historical. When we look at indigenous farming systems or crop systems, there is a huge amount of diversity in terms of vegetables, fruits, roots, tubers, various kinds of things. I think because of the way the world was after the Second World War and post-colonialism, I think there was a huge hunger crisis, and the investment all went into the major crops. And I think even the labeling, that these became called as underutilized. I mean, they were very much the staple of a lot of rural indigenous populations, but they got labeled as sort of minor, neglected, underutilized. And I think it's basically a neglect from us as researchers, as academia, as, in terms of meeting the immediate hunger need, which led to this huge investment in the 4 crops, the 4 major staples, which I don't deny at all, but I think that, Dr. Carrie Fowler did mention this morning that these are historical crops. So they're not new crops, the opportunity crops. They have always been there as part of people's food cultures. Always there has been a dietary diversity that has got diluted. And I think we need somehow, and also in many ways stigmatized. I come from South Asia, from India, and in a way millets, which is now, last year was the year of the millets, International Year of the Millets, which India actually promoted with the FAO. But it's a very nutritious crop, but basically it got stigmatized as the poor man's crop. So as the poor come out of poverty, you want to go to the rich man's crop, which is basically the big staples, which has nutritional implications. So I think there's a huge issue of mindset, of language, of how we project these crops, of what we invest in, which can really turn the balance for us moving forward.
Okay, thanks, Nithya. I know Ruth also wanted to make
Hey,
sure
Nicola,
that
nice to see you. So I think from my side, just to add to this, I'd say what other markets might you looking, like novel things we might do? So when you think about the number of crop protection products that are going off the market at the moment that are no longer available, then what about using crop diversity to assist with this? So thinking about that, actually, maybe you're a catch crop for something else. We've got a great project that's funded by DEFRA and Innovate UK, where we're trying to remove potato cyst nematode from the soil before you put the crop in, and we're using catch crop to do that, to actually pull it out of the ground in advance. I think use of our diversity to do this, to remove some of the chemicals we may be using or other synthetics, is also another angle we might want to think about for the use of our crop diversity.
Thank you. Maybe we have time for one more. No, we don't have time for question? Okay, we are past our time. So I've been told that we have to end here. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for all the speakers for all your insights that you gave to all of us. So give them a big round of applause. And if you have more questions, they'll probably be available during lunchtime.